UCT has opted to use is this idea of physically distanced learning. If you go looking in the broader internet world for information about what we're doing at UCT at the moment, you're probably going to find it listed under socially distanced learning. We opted to not use that term because we would like to believe that people can remain in close social contact despite being physically distanced from each other. So physically distanced learning, as UCT understands it, is a combination of online teaching and face-to-face teaching under physical distancing in limited ways. And of course, all of this is necessitated by the pandemic that we are all living through. And at the moment, this looks like what we're going to be doing for semester 1. Okay, so that's what physically distanced learning is. One of the things that we want to emphasize is what underpins these decisions. Okay, first and foremost is the idea of the physical safety. My apologies, that's just a silly pop-up. The physical safety of UCT staff and students. We can all imagine very easily how some of our big lecture theatres could quickly become quite dangerous spaces if we use them in the conventional ways. Obviously, there is also a concern about quality. Last year, there was substantial concerns around quality, and we were operating in a far more kind of emergency mode. So physically distanced learning, in comparison to emergency remote teaching, has more of an emphasis on quality. In the South African context particularly, we cannot get away from ideas around inequality and access, and we don't want to. We want to embrace those two things as issues that we must pay attention to in order to deem our work successful. So as part of the physically distanced learning, we need to make sure that there are two things that we consider. One is, how do we ameliorate the various structural inequalities that exist in our broader society that impact on our students' learning? And second of all, how might we use a particular framework, the Universal Design for Learning framework, to maximize student success? So those two things are very much at the heart of physically distanced learning as well. And then there's the issue of constraints. So there are various things that constrain us. There are operational and resource constraints. There are, we have to think about staffing, workload, timetabling, are venues available, are tutors available, what's happening with ESCOM, what's happening with public transport, is curfew an issue? All of that stuff is going to be issues that we're going to need to continue to think about on an ongoing basis. So that's something that people need to just hold in their heads as the thing that constrains the designs that we're suggesting. Okay, so what I'm going to ask you to do for a second is to take 2 minutes for yourself and to just think about, for yourself, how does physically distanced learning relate to ERT in your mind? What do you think might be different this year? And then second of all, to think about these principles, and I'm going to leave the principles up. And I'm going to ask you to think about, how do those principles impact on your choices? Okay, so this is, take 2 minutes and just think for yourself about this. And then we will move into a little activity around it. So question number 1, how does PDL relate to emergency remote teaching in your mind? And question number 2, how do these principles relate to each other in your context? And I'm going to give people a few minutes to think about that, and then we will come back to this together. Okay, so going to leave you there for just a minute longer. How does PDL relate to emergency remote teaching in your mind? And then in terms of those principles, how do you see them relating to or interacting with each other in your particular context? Okay, so let's take some responses to that. I think let's start with how does PDL relate to emergency remote teaching in your mind? And I'm going to ask everybody, we're just going to play with that little waterfall technique for a second. I'm going to ask you to go to the Zoom text chat, and I'm going to ask you to type your response in to that first question. How does physically distanced learning relate to emergency remote teaching? But I'm going to ask you to not hit enter. So type in your answer, but don't hit enter. And I'm going to give people 2 minutes to type in their answers, and then we will take our next step together. Okay, and I'm going to ask you to hit enter if you have finished typing in your response. All right, so picking up on some of the ideas that I'm seeing, PDL will allow some contact with most learning still being online. Yes, it will allow us to kind of learn from the 2020 experience, but there'll be a bit more of a focus on quality. We can plan for some synchronous elements, yes. We can, similar modality in many ways, but perhaps more prep time, possibility of synchronous interaction, being able to stay on top of students' progress. Yes, okay. So some of the elements relates very closely, bit more planning, bit more time, bit more options, still some uncertainty around it, allows for a human touch. Okay, much the same, better equipped, better prepared. Okay, so ERT was very much a very, very rapid response to a particular experience. And that made it a less than perfect response. And so where ERT is different from, or where PDL is different from ERT, is the kind of key issues that we picked out here. So the idea of focusing on design. We've lived through this once. So hopefully what we have is a little bit more time this time around for deliberate course design, for being able to refine the activities we've used to really build on what we've learned last year. Because there will be more students in residences, we have a little bit more flexibility in terms of access to resources. So our students who are in res will have their own devices. They will have access to UCT Wi-Fi. Students are being prioritized in terms of access to res in relation to constraints in their home environments. So there will be a bit more flexibility. I want to hang a big caveat on that and say that not all of our students who will continue to live at home or in other spaces around Cape Town will have great access to resources in their home space. But as you're going to see in a moment, there will be some limited access to campus as well. So students will be able to do things like download resources more easily. So while there is more flexibility in what we do in terms of synchronous and asynchronous teaching particularly, our fundamental concern should still be around accessibility for everybody in our classrooms. So as I was saying, better connectivity because of access to residences and UCT services, some limited access to campus. And one of the big changes that we need to be aware of, or the kind of big shifts back that we need to be aware of, is around student workload. So a massive issue for last year was how much we could expect students to work in the conditions that they were in. At the moment, the agreed upon workload is 45 hours per week. However, I think it's worth noting, and I speak for myself here, that time seems to function slightly differently under pandemic conditions. And people are carrying substantial other loads. So that 45 hours per week is not per course, it's obviously per student. So over 4 courses, which means that really we might be thinking about a student doing sort of in the region of 10 hours per course per week as a maximum. So we need to just bear that in mind. And very often we have no sense of what that means for our students. So that is an ongoing issue for all of us, I think. And along with the increase in the normal workload, we go back to normal grading processes as opposed to pass and fail. So I'm going to just take us one slide forward, and then we're going to pause for a second and see if we have any questions. So in practice, what is this looking like meaning for us? In practice, we're suggesting that for the most part, your content delivery activities, i.e. lectures, should be, where possible, pre-recorded. There will be exceptions in some of the areas that we've listed, and in spaces where you have final year students or postgrad students with very particular conditions, we're asking about, there is the opportunity for contact lectures there. But again, use this judiciously. Practicals, labs, tutorials, other kinds of active hands-on context-related learning activities will be able to happen at this point, but subject to the proper protocols around specifically number of people in rooms, ventilation of rooms, health protocols in terms of access to the session, notification protocols in terms of somebody who's been at the session being sick, etc. So those will be managed at an institutional level, at least partly through the Higher Ed app, Higher Ed Health app, and other services as they come online. In terms of assessment, in practice, what this means is that we're still promoting the idea of continuous assessment. It reduces risk for students in relation to particular single events, single assessment events, but it also allows us to compare what's happening with students over time. And that's a useful thing. Face-to-face exams at this point look like they will be possible, but it'll depend on exam type, and there will obviously be issues around exam integrity that we want to think about. In terms of assessments, as I've said, we're going to be using grades as normal this year, and all the other academic rules come back into effect. So issues around requisites and prerequisites and academic exclusion, etc., all come back to be part of our landscape. Okay, I'm going to pause for a second and let's see if we have any questions or comments at that point.
We had one question about the provision of data, which Stephen responded to in the chat. But Stephen, I don't know if you want to maybe respond on audio as well about what data students will get.
Sure, thanks, Tasneem. So as Shanani mentioned, we expect the access to be much better for students being back in residences, but there are obviously students who might still be relying on mobile data, and there is an agreement at the executive level to continue to provide monthly data bundles. There is a question about how to do that to reduce the cost to UCT, because it's about 1.7 million a month to allocate that. We've been issuing about 17,000 students with data bundles, and so there's sort of desire to reduce that to students who really need it rather than just give it en masse. So there might be a little bit more for students to do to opt into data bundles, but the in principle commitment is there. Having said that, we sort of have something of a concern around data and access to internet connectivity because of the sort of general wish to increase the use of synchronous teaching sessions using Zoom or Teams, and that's quite data heavy. And so there might be something of a mismatch between data access, even capped packages on fiber, for example, and sort of demands for synchronous sessions that are coming up. So it's still important to be aware of what sort of internet connectivity students have. So we're sort of concerned about a vulnerable group. It's a bit like the missing middle. They're not students who are in residences. They're students who might be living in Cape Town, even just with poor home connectivity. And last year, there was a lot of awareness and focus on very low tech asynchronous, and that bar is moving up. And so there, again, might be a bit of a gap between what courses and lecturers are wanting students to do and the effective access that students have. So that's something to be aware of as the term starts, and also be in touch with your students about what type of access they have.
There's one other question. Will the data be available from February, since health science students are back in Feb and not March?
I will follow that up specifically. I think it might be allocated to health sciences students as they need it, for example. But okay. I will pass that on to ICTS as an issue.
Thank you. Shonali?
Thank you very much. Thanks, Tash. Thanks, Stephen. And thank you for the questions. So folks, before we move on, are there any comments that people want to make? Please feel free to turn on your mic. Yeah, Nsiki, thank you. So priority in residences will be extended to vulnerable students. Yes, indeed, the playing field will still not be level, and it never will. Like in our context in South Africa, we've got a lot of work before the playing field is anything like level. I think that the idea of normal functioning is not something that we should, I think that normal needs to be challenged. There are, you can think of, so for me, what I would suggest that we think about is the idea of resilient course design that SILT has been talking about and that other people on campus have been talking about as well. And I'm not sure that we've specifically flagged that term yet, or I haven't. So let me flag it now. You need a plan A and a plan B. If you're going to engage in some kind of teaching activity that is relatively high risk, in other words, a teaching activity that might be a face-to-face activity, there needs to be a plan B for that activity that is low risk. So, for example, last year, there were various departments that held some limited face-to-face activities. And the minute a single student got sick, that activity had to suspend for a number of days while everybody got tested, et cetera, et cetera. So in one particular group, students had to do 4 tests. And that was difficult and expensive. So we need to think about very carefully about how we might manage the risks, and we're going to talk about those risks in a second, so that we can offer our students the most seamless learning experience and also protect ourselves from the constant changing between modes that the incredibly sort of uncertain context that we're currently working in pushes us into. So let's hold on to that as we look at some of the ideas around risk that we would like to share with you today.
Shonali, there's a few more questions in the chat, which I don't know if you want to come back to later or deal with them now.
Can we come back to them after the risk bit? Because that's I think fine. It might respond to some of those.
Yeah, okay.
Okay. So we have an extensive document that looks at the risks and unknowns. And what I'm going to try and do here is I'm going to try and summarize some of that document for you and kind of give you the framework for it. So generally, these are some of the risks that UCT is facing at the moment. So anytime that our students have to get onto public transport, their level of risk is substantially increased. Some of our international students may struggle to make it into Cape Town at all. The issue around zero rating is always at risk because it depends on an agreement with cell phone companies. And so that's going to be something that we need to keep very careful eyes on. We may not have sufficient teaching capacity in the sense that we may need more tutors or we may need more lecturers or TAs. And so our staffing is actually a bit of an area of risk. And then finally, in terms of UCT's physical setup, our venues are an issue of risk. So overall venue capacity is substantially reduced. And there is a venues list that's available, and we will hyperlink this to that. You can look at that document. After the session, we'll send out these slides and you can actually go and look at these in more detail. But very quickly, we've categorized the risks into things that are not really within our locus of control to things that we have more control over. So for example, these items that are shaded red are things that we actually have very little control over. So in fact, we have no control over, let's be honest. The pandemic trajectory, zero rating, and access to campus via public transport are all issues of risk that can change outside of our control. So in our planning, it would be a good idea to have some sense of what your plan is. For example, for a student who says, I live with somebody who is who has a high risk for COVID, and so I'm only going to be able to come to campus for key events. What's my plan for that person? Do they really have to be on campus? So this is there, and you may read through this obviously at your own kind of leisure. But those three risks are things that we cannot control, but do substantially shape our design choices. So other things that UCT has a little bit more control over, access to campus. So at this point, students are not allowed unrestricted to access to campus. And so that's going to have consequences for whether or not students are able to learn as easily as they might on campus. Depending on how the situation changes and in relation to kind of national protocols around that, access to campus may either be increased or reduced, depending on issues such as lockdown. Obviously, our teaching venues have limited capacity at the moment. At the moment, we are limited by the lockdown 3 regulations that currently stand. So venues may have no more than 50 people in them. Stephen, please correct me if I'm wrong there. But that list of venues is constantly changing based on UCT's refurbishment of certain venues in terms of ventilation and air conditioning and so on. But for the time being, we're capped at 50 in all venues as a maximum. Smaller venues obviously have smaller caps. Computer lab capacity is a kind of ongoing difficulty and something that we will need to plan for and that staff will need to plan for. So students will not have the kind of 24-hour access that we've really grown accustomed to, where people are in the lab, in the comm labs at like 3 o'clock in the morning, working away. So those are things that we're going to have to pay attention to. Our day students will be particularly challenged in the current context because they're not going to have access to obviously the kind of internet, etc., that's available at residences. So some of them may be in a very difficult position in terms of that, and UCT is going to try and deal with that by continuing to offer cell phone data to students. But we do need to pay careful attention to what's happening with our day students as well. Not all of our day students are in the best learning conditions they could be. And as we've said, availability of tutors. In relation to tutors, please, if you feel like you need additional tutorial support, please, please, please be in contact with your department, with your HOD. Your HOD must be in contact with your dean. And there is a fund that is available for that, but please, HODs and then deans to access that fund. And then issues that are much less of an issue at the moment because of various decisions and support activities. For the most part, students will have access to laptops and the internet. As was pointed out, there is definitely a move to prioritize students who are in difficult infrastructural positions having access to residences first. So that's going to hopefully mitigate some of that issue. But again, big caveat, part of our job is to figure out for our class as early as possible, what are their particular constraints? At an institutional level, we can say that students have laptops, but somebody's killed a laptop over the holidays and something's fallen on it, something's been taken from them. We do need to still be aware of those things. Stephen, jump in.
Thanks, Shonali. Just on that residence issue, my understanding is that the residence allocation policy is sort of back to normal. So I don't think there's a specific process to establish student vulnerability in terms of internet access, for example, as an access to residence condition like there was last year.
Okay.
It does end up that, you know, many of the students in residence are those who we want to be in residence anyway, but I haven't heard of a separate process that's going to say, yes, do you have poor connectivity, you're prioritized for residence. The residence allocation is the same as it would have been in 2019, for example.
Right. Thank you. I appreciate the clarification. Okay, and then at the moment, our students have been advised that they do need to be present in Cape Town. And so that will hopefully increase the possibility of students being able to participate in any physically distanced learning activities that you may plan for them. Okay, I am going to pause there for a second and turn my camera on and say, does anyone have any questions or comments that they particularly want to air before we move into some conversation?
Shonali.
Rochelle, hi, good to see you.
For this. It's very useful. One of the difficulties I have, you know, you say we quite a lot, and I'm never quite sure who the we is, but
I know it probably changes. I'm sorry.
No, it's fine. You're a linguist in me, but one of the difficulties, you know, when you say we have to be aware of our students' constraints, is our convene a large program, as you know,
Yes.
195 students last year, and we set to have that amount this year.
Yeah.
And when it comes to the issuing of laptops or the data issues or whatever, and that, it all comes back to me. So I had 195 people in my inbox for most of last year. And as you know, I'm very committed.
Yes.
Working with the students on an individual basis, but that is overwhelming, you know, and there's no real support for that level of engagement. And administrators actually don't get given, I don't know, none of us actually get given the avenues and the mechanisms for knowing how to deal with these problems. Like, I know my way around the university, but I just spend hours and hours trying to figure out who to contact, when to contact, all of these kinds of things. And when students try and do it themselves, because I always try and make the students do it themselves first, people don't answer them, you know. So it actually becomes almost impossible because it becomes reliant on one person. And I'm not just talking about myself here now, because I know many academics have experiences that we are the front line for the students because they're absolutely desperate. And it's no point in saying go to the administrator because they don't have a clue either, and you spend all that time going backwards and forwards.
Yeah.
I just wanted to highlight that, not dumping on you, obviously, you know the answer.
No.
But just for people to think about those avenues, because it's all very well for the institution to make these global statements, but then the nitty-gritty on the ground, you know.
Absolutely. I think one of the things that has been incredibly difficult in the last year for teaching staff, whether they are lecturers or TAs or anybody who has direct contact with students, is you are the place where everything lands. And whether that everything is student health or mental health, or my data bundle didn't arrive, or my laptop hard drive crashed, and I think one of the things that could definitely be, that I think we are working on, and again, Stephen and Janet and Thomas are in the room and might want to jump in on this. I think that there is this year space in the orientation program to help clarify what the routes are for certain kinds of support for students. However, I think what's not going to change is students are always going to come to you because because you are their person. You are the closest they, lecturers are the closest they have to a person on campus, right? So I think what would also be useful is I think we must pick up on Susan's suggestion that the documentation that we share to our students to say, here's where you go for laptops, here's where you go for data, here's where you go for, digital literacy support or blah, blah, blah. We also need to bundle those in a way that staff can access them.
Yeah.
Because I think in those crises our students
the
struggle.
admin systems, so the people on the ground who are supposed to be supporting us have to be brought in better.
Yes.
So admin assistants and departmental staff and that, they're not going to read all these documents. They need to be brought into faculty level meetings and also briefed and helped to support, and given better connectivity and all of those issues. Because
absolutely,
we can design whatever, but you can't actually spend enough time on the teaching and learning process if you're always overwhelmed
with the admin and the care.
Yeah, but thanks for that.
And I think you've highlighted a really important point here, which is that last year, in the kind of emergency-ness of the situation, people took on a lot of work if they felt that for one reason or another, other systems were not coping with it. So a lot of our administrative staff are not in the habit of having a laptop at home for work purposes, for example. The work is at UCT 8 to 5 or 9 to 5 or whatever it is. And so those things will change. And I think that those are, you're absolutely right, people. The notion of the teaching team and who supports teaching unequivocally has been challenged over the last year. And we need to hold on to that. So thank you for that.
And
I appreciate that comment.
Support those admin staff better.
Absolutely.
To be able to do the job that we expect of them.
Yes.
Thank you.
Stephen, is that a new hand or an old hand?
It's actually an old hand. I'll just.
But you're going to take advantage of it.
Take advantage of it. Let me lower my hand. So we had a lot of sort of communications overload last year, where there was so much coming out that people simply didn't have time to read all of it, and so many people had questions that in some ways had been answered, but it was answered once in an email or on a website, and then it wasn't widely known. And there was also, I think, a communications blockage between what got to faculties at the level of deans and deputy deans and what filtered down even to lecturers and to department admin staff. So there is a little bit more time this year. There's more emphasis on students knowing what they need to do. For example, the laptop program is opt-in. So we're not surveying students to say, do you have a laptop or not? There was a DVC desk from Loretta Ferris that said, here's the laptop program. Students need to go and opt into that on PeopleSoft. And then for staff particularly, we do encourage people to join the online teaching community on Teams, and you can ask questions there, and that's also monitored by our team. And so we can refer people to the best available information that we have, although often we're telling people what we know about what other people are doing. Right, so the CARES team, I think, discussed that with Rieshna. I mean, what they're trying to do is join up, I guess, all the different support services, and that's also the difficulty for students and staff, is there's so many different parts of campus that support students in different ways, but sometimes they're complex problems that it's not clear who should solve the problem, and sometimes students just don't know where to go, or staff don't know where to go. And also, please encourage your faculties to pass on information and have these discussions through whatever forums there are. A lot of information does get given to faculty representatives, and there are these weekly or bi-weekly teaching online task team meetings, which sort of surface queries and issues that come up from faculties. But there's still a challenge, I think, getting the information right from the top of the decision makers down widely. There's also a concern, people, it's a tension between consulting people and taking decisions quickly and then communicating decisions quickly. I don't think we found a perfect answer to it. But again, please encourage people to join that online teaching community site on Teams, which is a good place to ask.
Okay, thank you, Stephen. Nsiki, I see a hand. Do you want to jump in?
Yes, thank you, Shanali, and thank you,
Hi
colleagues.
there,
So
welcome.
earlier on, you suggested that we opt for a resilient cost design.
Yeah.
Have a plan A and a plan B.
Yeah.
Now, when I think back to last year, we had the advantage in that the students were with us for some time. So for about 8 weeks before we went online. So we had already established a relationship with them. And in fact, we used that to our advantage in that we did our own audit before the university audit, and we could establish what was possible with students, what forms of communications were most reliable. And so this year it's going to be different, because our students are first years. And so it means that on the day that they land on campus is going to be the day that we have our first interaction. So this planning for an alternative is going to be somewhat of a challenge. I mean, we thought about, using the outside space for a face-to-face contact, that initial face-to-face contact. But that is going to depend on the weather. And as we were planning for that, we were also saying that we need to source grass mats, so that we encourage and facilitate that approach, which is familiar to some students. But when you think of that, it means that that's an extra item that one has to plan for. So you can't say to students, bring mats, because you don't know who is coming through to our institution. You're not yet ours. And so that in itself presents a challenge. And again, something else about the physical distance learning and the space. It assumes that the facilitators themselves will be able to facilitate face-to-face. And yet we know that that is not always going to be possible for the same reasons that we spoke about around the pandemic factors, issues around social distancing at home and what is happening to the family. And so it makes the planning rather difficult, because in mind, you know what you want to achieve. However, I mean, when I look at last year and the challenges that we had to face, by the time we got to second semester, we had somewhat stabilized in our processes and in our approach. However, now looking at this year, I'm somewhat challenged, in that I think we are going to have to find new ways of teaching with a curriculum that is in progress. We have so many public holidays because we're starting late. If we had started earlier, April, students would have had the Easter holiday, but they don't have it this year. So we are starting right bang in the middle of those many, many public holidays. So we're losing a lot of teaching time. And so if you think about the first semester, I mean, for me, it's fraught with challenges. For the reasons, that are beyond our control. And the fact that we literally on a wing of prayer. We hope that they will start in time. We don't know. And also then, when they start speaking about the third wave, you're like, oh my God. So that could be in the middle.
Yeah.
You know, we don't know. And
Dates
so,
look like around about exam
one
time,
could
actually.
go on to talk about plan C and plan
Yeah.
D, but it's difficult. So I would, I mean, if we think about what has worked, we got to a point where we managed to stabilize with the, online learning, the remote online learning. However, we understand that this is now with a different group of students. So we have to start again. So that for us is a challenge.
Thank you, Nsiki. I think I want to first of all acknowledge that the last 2 years have not been an easy teaching, or the last year and this year coming are not easy teaching territory for anybody. We are continuing to give our students opportunities to learn in what is a very, very difficult context. Difficult for us personally, in terms of our professional practice, for anybody who's in the health sciences and has clinical work, terrifyingly difficult, and then difficult for our students as well in their context. So I think the first thing that we absolutely just have to acknowledge is that the level of challenge is by no means reduced. I think the thing that I want to emphasize though from what Nsiki was saying was last year people found ways and means of doing things that actually worked. And they worked really, really well. I don't think you must feel that you need to put those down and do something different because now there's a new label, okay? So if you did something last year and that really worked, you don't have to change it, all right? If you want to supplement it in some way because you can, then go for that. But don't feel like you need to throw out all the things you figured out and learned last year because there's a kind of new label for this. The second thing that I want to just acknowledge out of what Nsiki was saying was that bringing our students into the UCT space this year is going to be very tough. Yes, last year we had them for like 5-6 weeks, and then in week 6, life fell apart for everybody and we had to do something different. Please, can we encourage you? There are a number of specific workshops that are geared to how do I start my year? Like, what's the thing I do to connect with my students, to figure out who they are, to help them figure out who I am, to have them in conversation with each other, to get them to connect with each other. Stuff that we take for granted when you're sitting in a physical lecture theatre together. So there are a number of workshops that will focus on that this year. And please, I would encourage you to take advantage of those. And this is not just to Nsiki, this is to everybody. Because that process of, I think of it as like constituting my classroom. Instead of constituting it in the brick walls of a building, I now have to constitute it in a complex space. Sometimes we'll be in a building and sometimes we'll be online. And we might not always all be in that same space at the same time. So thinking about that process of how do you want to constitute your space for your students is going to be really, really important. And it's got to work for everyone on that course team, program team, etc. So that's something that groups can sit down and work on together, and that we're happy to either consult with groups on or, you know, to build into workshop structures. Okay, so thank you to both Rochelle and Nsiki for those incredibly provocative questions. I hope that we will be able to take them forward. Nsiki, I don't feel like I've given you enough time there. I'm sorry. Let's pick this conversation up in one of the other spaces. Please feel free to give us a shout and we will continue the conversation. So moving on, folks, we were talking about our risks and our unknowns. What we're suggesting is that, and I'm just going to highlight this for you because you might be able to identify yourself somewhere in this space. We've sort of identified 6 models for physically distanced learning. Okay, and these would be models where you have either a large course with labs or a studio component, or a practical component, a course with student performances, a large course with tutorials. The items are on your screen, small courses, seminars, etc. For each of those, what we have put together is a a sort of a description of what resilient design might look like in relation to content delivery, the kind of active learning where you might want some elements of face-to-face contact and assessment. What I would suggest you do is that you have a look at each of that you kind of identify where your course might fit, and it might fit kind of between two things somewhere. So you identify where your course might fit, and you then, when we send you these slides, if you click on this link, it'll take you to the Google Doc that has a more expanded version of this. But this will start to give you some idea of what you could do. So for example, with large courses with labs or studios, there might be the opportunity to pre-record content, to use a fair amount of online tutorials, and then instead of having 80 students all in the biosciences lab at the same time, maybe there are groups of, I guess you'd have to have somewhere between 16 and 20 students in the lab at a time. So, and that could then spread itself out over the day, but that would then have consequences for staffing, because you might need to have fewer tutors in the room at a time, but you might have multiple sessions running in a day. And those are conversations that need to happen in departments and in relation to venues, rather than necessarily in a large space like this. So on the slides, which we will share with you, we've got this plan, kind of a suggested possible design for those 6 spaces that I talked about. And we're not going to go into them in detail today. But I think the useful thing to think about is, what are your next steps? So I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a second. And I just want to ask you, having thought about the difference between ERT and PDL, what lessons we can pull from ERT into PDL into 2021, having thought actually about all of your experience over the course of your career, what are the things that you are really going to, what are the things that you want to take forward and do? So what are the particular risks for your group that you're really concerned about, that you want to mitigate? What is the one thing that you think that you would be able to pay attention to that might shift your class in a positive direction? Okay, so that's a single question that I'm effectively asking very poorly. My question is, moving forward, what is the next step for you? And I'm going to ask you to just jump into the text chat and pop that in as soon as you're ready. Yes, I think, Anita, mitigating student isolation is going to be something that we really need to think about. And in a weird way, we can't police it in the ways that we normally do in a kind of face-to-face setting. And so we're going to have to make our opportunities for student engagement inherently meaningful in order to draw students in perhaps ways that we can get away with not doing, when we can say you have to be in this chat at this time and you have to sign in. So yes, student isolation is something that is going to require creative responses. So what are the things that you are going to go away and act on or think about after our chats today? Pop into the text chat as soon as you're ready and hit enter whenever you are ready. I'm not going to hold anyone to an enter. So Stella's saying, move away from one final assessment, break the course down. Yes, I think the single final assessment activity is an incredibly risky one. Nsiki mentioned third waves. I have thus far restrained myself from saying too much about it, but a third wave is very possible in the South African context. There is some literature that suggests that it's something we could expect around about the end of autumn, beginning of winter, which, that's right, is May and prime exam season. So bear that in mind when you're planning. It is entirely possible that the shape of our exams will be challenged by an additional surge. So will there be efforts by UCT for students to help meet each other that prove the hardest for us? Marion, in a physical sense, probably very limited. Students in reses, I think, will have more opportunities than perhaps students who are staying in private residences or in rental accommodation around UCT. There are in the orientation programs opportunities for students to meet online. Is Thomas in the room? No, I thought he might have been. I was hoping that, Janet, do you have any sense of whether or not the orientation program is doing any physical contact?
I'm not actually in that,
Oh,
so I can't give you feedback.
Okay. Sorry, Janet, my apologies.
I'm sorry, apologies, but I haven't heard anything reported about that, Shanali, so I'm not sure.
Okay, I suspect that in the orientation time, they're going to keep students in a little bit away from each other because of people traveling and exposure and so on. So yes, what else is going on in the text chat? Peer reviews of students' work. Yes, particularly using tools like using video feedback, getting students to give each other video feedback can be very useful. Looking at planning to incorporate student engagement. Tass, you want to jump in? Is there anything very, very that you want to pick out of the text? Because I see you in the text.
I've seen quite a few people say that something about sort of smaller assessments and monitoring engagement and how feedback was maybe given too far apart. So I do recommend, as far as possible, making smaller assessments, even if it's really like a mini quiz or forum or blog reflection, because it allows students to stay on track for their course and also gives you insight into what students are doing and how they are doing. And you might need extra tutor capacity depending on the size of your course, but I do recommend smaller assessments.
So I also see quite a bit around synchronous sessions. And I think that one of the things that PDL technically allows us is space for the synchronous sessions. But I think that what we have to do is we have to be very aware still of students who might be excluded by those kinds of activities and how we can continue to support their engagement. Janet, I hear a mic.
Yes, I just wanted to say there's just firstly, Stephen did respond and say that the orientation's planned for online, and I think everybody else has been also giving that feedback. So assume there won't be formal contact through the online, through the orientation programs. But I wanted to respond really about the discussion on engagement. I think a lot of people are raising this concern and about including students, especially for first year groups, and I wanted to encourage anybody in the webinar to attend some of the upcoming workshops that Shanali and others will be running that'll be looking at some of the options that either using existing Vula tools, and we have been exploring in preparation for this some of the other third-party tools. So we'd really invite you to look out for announcements about webinars and resources. You know, there are things like the existing capacities of MS Teams, which is a part of UCT's environment already, and some new tools, as Stephen posted, that we will be trialing and inviting you to try. So yeah, just saying, I think this is a real opportunity to try out some different ways of engaging students, given there was a big feedback from all of us and from students last year.
Okay, so folks, just as we're closing then, we will consolidate some of the ideas that have come out in the chat. So please feel free to continue to pop your ideas in there. Two places that we want to direct you to. The SILT's teaching resources page has had a major revamp. And materials are organized around the ideas of getting started, course design, course creation, student engagement, and assessment. So you should be able to find the kinds of materials that you're looking for quite easily there. And you can access that via the SILT homepage or by clicking on the links on this PowerPoint when we send it through to you. Please look at the support and services option on the SILT homepage. In addition to the webinars, the workshops, design studio, there's also the opportunity for one-on-one consultations or small group consultations, and we would like to invite you to pull us into things, to think through things with you, and to see what we can offer in terms of that. I want to emphasize in terms of the chat what's been going on quickly. People are talking about MS Teams and alternate tools as well. And I think that that's very important. We do have the opportunity with physically distanced learning to have a little more space for some of those kinds of explorations. And I think we must encourage that, but we must also be aware of who's excluded and not excluded by doing so.
You missed the last slide.
Oh, did I miss a whole slide? I'm sorry, that's terrible.
It's a more detailed slide on our services.
Ah, silly me. Okay, and then, oh, spelling error. SILT support and services, if you click on that link, you will be able to see consultations as a one-on-one consults, upcoming workshops. We've got something coming up quite quickly tomorrow on rapid design, Vula lessons, and course site setup, all important. And then the design studio starts end of next week. So please feel free to register for that as well. We would encourage it. It's a way to think through the whole of your semester. I'm going to stop there, folks. It's past 11, so we're going to fly away. And I'm sure that many of you need to fly away to things. Thank you so much, everybody, for your time and your attention. This session will run on repeat every 2 weeks. So if you have colleagues joining you who are new to the UCT context or who are just kind of finding their feet in the space, suggest that they come along and join us. Please feel free to send us questions and queries, and we will send you an email with a kind of summary of this conversation. And we will upload the recording to the SILT YouTube channel. If you haven't followed the SILT YouTube channel, please do that.